Hello, preacher. You are a servant of God, and the work you are doing is so important. This is a ministry mentoring podcast where we want to encourage preachers every week, helping you start strong, keep going, and keep growing. This podcast is hosted by the Brown Trail School of Preaching. My name is Caleb Griffith. I'm a field representative here at the school. I'm joined today by Kevin Rhodes, who is the executive director, and Neil Steidoff, who is our dean of students. In the first few episodes of the podcast, we are focusing on your first year in ministry, looking at topics that are especially relevant to new preachers, to those who have just graduated school and are beginning their first work. One of the first things you do as you are looking for a work is get to know the leadership of that church. If the congregation has elders, and for today we'll assume that the church does have elders, then as you are getting involved in the work, interviewing, or whatever that process is, you're most likely coordinating the most with the elders. And so your relationship with them begins before you ever move into the work. But in those first few weeks and months of the work, there is a critical stage where you are going to begin those relationships on site and in the work. And so today we're going to talk about how to start elder relationships right, how to get off on the right foot, how to get moving and make progress in those relationships in a way that's going to help you for the rest of your time there in ministry. And so we're going to go through a few different things that will help us in a very practical way to begin those relationships. Kevin, could you just tell us a little bit about some of your experiences with elderships in the past?
Well, sure. I think that, first of all, the fact you recognize there are differences, that elderships are not going to be the same everywhere you go. And because people are different, they're going to approach things a different way. So when you look at it, I think about what's their background, what's their work background, how long have they served together, how long have they served individually. All of those things are going to matter. It's also going to make a difference of how old they are, because it's going to affect their energy levels, how much time they have. Are they still working, or are they retired? What type of job do they do? All of those things actually affect how the eldership operates and how you get to interact with them. If you go into a congregation that has mainly older retired men as elders, they're just not going to be as active doing some of the things that you as a younger person usually coming out of school are going to be wanting to do. They're not going to want to get out and be as involved. They're not going to want to go to the same kind of things. Now, that's kind of overall, you might underestimate some men of what they'd be willing to do. So you don't want to just write that off. I just want to make sure that everyone understands that people are different, and that because their time commitment and their energy levels and their own health background might change, you cannot simply expect the same out of everyone. It also matters, what is their freedom? What are the natural things? So what you're looking for are, what are the normal things that eldership does to be together? That would be one of the first things I'm looking for. What are the natural times, whether in meetings? I want to know, how often do they meet? And I would recommend you find that out in the interview if you can. That's really relevant information. And then find out if you are invited to those meetings, or how often do they want to meet with you. You're not going to be able to be in every meeting, but every opportunity in those meetings is an opportunity to interact and therefore learn something and grow the relationship. Now, I realize sometimes in these meetings, it can be tough because not everything's just super exciting and moving at a fast pace, but it's still important to understand how they think and what they bring to the table. I want to be spending time with them as much as I can, and just to kind of find out how they work.
I think that a big part of that, like you say, it's building that relationship. I mean, we just said starting relationships off right, but that relationship, I think, is the key word here, because yes, you're going to have, for lack of a better term, a business or a official relationship with them in terms of their role in the congregation, your role in the congregation. But you're not going to be effective in developing that relationship if you're not developing an actual personal relationship with them, if you're not getting to know them, if you're not spending that social time with them in whatever capacity that is available. I know whenever I started several years ago, COVID was still going on. And what ends up happening is, in that particular scenario, I was actually kept from starting off the social side of getting to know my elders, and so that just created a lot of difficulties there. So it's really, really important to be able to get to know them in that kind of framework, I think, because that helps everything else work more smoothly.
Yes, you have to be able to balance out, I'd say, try to find social situations because that introduces you to who they are. I still remember this story. At the time, this man was not serving he was a deacon rather than an elder, but he ultimately became an elder. And I learned about this story like the first week we were at a place and we went and traveled together. And when we were eating together, the other elders were bringing up this story about what he had done. And it was funny. It told you something about his personality. And as he's trying to interact with them and how they're interacting together, it shows you how their relationship works. But you're wanting to try to create opportunities where you can interact with them in a more official, and I do like that kind of wording rather than business, an official capacity within meetings or sometimes just conversations that are private to find out what they're thinking about something, or you're needing to relay some information that you've learned to them. That's important to your relationship. And then also settings that are just casual and social, whether it's going out to eat on Sunday regularly, or maybe even another day of the week together, that you're interacting in ways that you can maybe bring up some things, but it's incidental rather than the purpose of being together. And that puts the relationship on a solid footing because it's letting them know that you can relax a little bit and that you're interested in them too for who they are. And sometimes it's interesting to see how things shift between an official meeting and a social get together when you're putting those things together.
Your job is to try and learn about these men who you are going to be submitting to in their role as leaders and in your role as the minister. Your job is to try and understand them better, understand how they think, understand how you can kind of click with them and relate to them and all those kind of things. This is the time to be listening, to be learning, to be allowing them to kind of take the lead, not in terms of the effort you're putting in, but in terms of just trying to understand them and where they're coming from.
So I'm hearing a lot of you have to not just start with the official side of the relationship, and I like that distinction of business versus official, but you have to start with a more personal kind of relationship with your elders. Can you give us any insight into relating to the elders as a group, as the eldership, versus relating to individual elders? Kevin, you mentioned how, elders have different personalities, and you can start getting to know those different personalities. Does that affect how you work with the elders as a group versus individually?
Absolutely. For example, you need to pay attention to what the interests of each elder is, what they tend to know more about. It's what's going on in the congregation, because that's who you should go to when that issue comes up. That's most likely the person you need to bring it to. They're going to be more interested. They're going to be more likely to know some more things about it, know the answers. And they'll be more likely to bring it before the other elders when there's some kind of problem related, because that's something that's really stays on their radar. So if you pay attention to that kind of part of what their interest level is, if they are a Bible class teacher and they've done that for a long time and they enjoy that, or that really matters to them, then if you've got some kind of problem or something came up in the Bible class program, then that's a natural person to go to. Some maybe have background in dealing with the physical side of things. And also I will tell you that sometimes you need to know who not to take a problem to because of, their kind of approach. It's just one of those things where some will take it and roll with it and end up kind of, okay, that's definitely not the thing that needs to happen here. But their tendency, you just know their tendency is to kind of go and solve it in a way that is unhelpful, shall we say, or they may not, because they can move on their own or kind of get ahead of everything. For example, one of the things that sometimes you have to work with are if you have a home that's provided. Some people do, some people don't. But you want to try to figure out who is good at dealing with issues at the home, and who is interested in carrying and making sure that remains an asset versus who, for example, is interested in maintaining the budget and therefore is going to only spend as little as possible on those kind of things. Or the person who is easily lets it go, that, maybe their house is not kept up as well, different issues, older, the issues become different because their perspectives are very different. So you want to find someone, not because you're trying to be prejudicial or trying to, you still need to bring it to all the elders, but one person is more likely to understand the issues. Ideally, I really like to take it to everyone, because one of the wrong practices, I would say, that is actually very common is the decision to sidle up to one man who's an elder and work only through him, and that becomes the way you interact with an eldership. I highly discourage that model. Even though it's a lot easier, but it is not a healthy model. You want to have an interaction with all of them. You're just trying to use their strengths and their involvement together in the best way possible. I'm like thinking of, like I was mentioning, the house. Somebody else is going to live in that house after me. I don't want them to come in, and because I didn't point out certain things, that it's not as quality as what it was when I had it. I want to make sure it's maintained and just make sure that's good, because it's not mine. Okay. So do the best thing possible. And it's more a matter of just knowing your strengths and weaknesses of certain men, who are the best to deal with problems. I felt so sorry. One man in the eldership, he consistently was tapped to give bad information to the congregation because he was by far the best at remaining calm and explaining things, and he would do it. But it's just, he always seemed to end up being the one that's, I told him, I said, you can't do that all the time. Otherwise, people are going to be scared every time he gets up there. You just can't do that to the congregation. So you just kind of be aware of what's going on.
Yeah, I think what you said about strengths and weaknesses is crucial, because the whole point, and this is something that I'm afraid, because sometimes there can be tension between preachers and elders, I'm afraid we kind of lose sight of this a lot. Elders and preachers are supposed to be working together as a team. That's not only the biblical model, that's the only way this works to help the congregation. Otherwise, we create power struggles, we create all sorts of tension. It just doesn't work. And so if you are a team, and if you are all individual members of a team with different roles, as a minister, you have a role, elders, they have a role as elders, but also each of them is going to have a role within the eldership to a certain degree, in terms of their strengths and their weaknesses. You, as part of that team, need to understand who you are trying to tap for help given a specific situation. For example, one thing that I always noticed whenever I was trying to do certain things is that if I'm going to talk with certain people, like whether it's going to visit or different things like that, I would try and pick an elder to go with me. Number one, I wanted an elder to go with me, but I would try and pick an elder to go with me that would just personality-wise resonate with the person I was going to talk to, I was going to visit. Different personalities click, and that's not a right or wrong thing. That's just a thing. But that means you have to have a feel for which elders are going to click with which people. There are some elders that, no offense to them, they're not bad people in any way. I'm not going to pick them to talk to a specific person that I have in mind, because there's going to be unnecessary tension there. That's just part of knowing your elders, and that's why it's so valuable.
You talk about working with the elders as a team. And I think we all agree that's so important. But even when doing that, you also have to respect the role of the elders that's different from your own.
Yep.
What does submitting to the elders look like as a preacher, and how might that be different from submitting to the elders as a member?
It's really not different if we understand what submission is and what we are submitting to. The problem sometimes is viewing elders and the eldership in what is an American business model way rather than a biblical spiritual way. The way it's set up is so that we are responsible as preachers for taking the word out and making sure what God's will is on any given thing is known, and that is known by the elders too. So they are accountable to listen to what we have to say, as so long as we're bringing them the word. They're also responsible for making sure that's what we're doing. But then their primary responsibility is then for implementation. Now, how it looks specific to a preacher is because of implementation and because their responsibility is partially on how that message is being communicated, then they do have a role in kind of telling you, here's what we want you to do on this. Sometimes it's, we've got this issue. We don't want you to preach on this right now. We're working behind the scenes. And you could understand and say, okay, what's the timeline? Because this has to be addressed. People, if we wait too long, people are going to think we're ignoring it. How long do you need and why? So don't be afraid to ask questions, but then you're following along. So that's one thing. It could also be that you're going to go with a program. You're take an idea into a meeting and you're going to have an idea of here's what we want to do. And in that process, they may look at it and they may see it a very different way. It could be that it's too much change for them, meaning that they don't find anything wrong. So now it's a matter of expediency. And even what you're bringing to them might be a great kind of approach. If it's too much change, people who are not used to that much change, it's hard to get a yes on. Okay. So just understand that.
When I think about elder and minister relationships, the illustration of marriage is really helpful, I think. And especially now that I'm married, I'd heard it before I was married. I was like, oh, that kind of makes sense. But I think about how many times I make a decision or I say something or I do something. And I guarantee you, my wife just looks at me like, really? And yet, what is she responsible to do in this relationship? We're a team, right? But she has to submit to me while also recognizing there are areas where I really need to learn and I need to improve and I need to grow.
Yeah.
That is going to be you as a minister. You are going to have these times where you're going to recognize, yes, I see something in this elder or this eldership, maybe even, that they need to grow and they don't see it yet. That is going to be a struggle because going back to your question, Caleb, how do I interact with the elders in this role where I'm the minister, they're the elders, I'm submitting to them, and yet I sometimes recognize there are areas they need to grow that I need to help. And I think about how my wife can be very good at just saying, this is something that I'm seeing and I really want to bring this up because I think it's an issue. And I'm like, wow, I've never thought of that before. At least I hope that's my response, right? And that's kind of the same thing as walking this line of being submissive, being humble, while at the same time being like, here's something you're not thinking about that I think you need to think about.
No, I totally agree with that. The way in which you have to do this ought to make you appreciate a wife's role in submission a lot.
Yes.
And whereas I think a lot of times as preachers, we get out there, we've got all these ideas, and we just think that, whether it's we came out of school with them or we just see what's there, and we just want to run with everything. And that's rarely a good idea. And elders have an idea of pacing too to them. You are being plugged in to a situation that is moving at its own pace. And you have to adjust to that pace. And that's where understanding the eldership really can make a difference, is you're trying to see how they're pacing things and y'all are adjusting to one another. So,
yes.
If you say, well, I've just got to be moving, got to always be doing, well, good, you need a hobby. You need to do something on the side then, because you've still got to move at the pace the congregation can move, and the congregation can only move at the pace that the elders can move. So you have to be able to figure that out. And that goes back, I think, to what you were saying, Neil, about the approach, if you're going to submit, is that learn to ask questions rather than make demands. You're going in and you're making requests, but you're also just asking questions. So not every question needs to be a request. Sometimes the question is asked in such a way so that you, again, depending upon who the elder is, that you can ask and just kind of, you're bringing something up and you're bringing something to their attention. Like, when was the last time we conducted church discipline here? Which that's a question I would often ask in an interview as well. You ask the question of, I noticed that you do this. Could you explain to me why? Because I've never seen it done that way. And all you're trying to do is create a dialogue. If there's something you see as a problem, you're trying to open up opportunities for the elders to think about it. Have they just accepted something? Did they inherit a situation? Is this something that is just part of the culture of the congregation that maybe needs to shift? Telling them that you can't believe that they're numbskull enough to do all that. That's not how you do it. You ask questions as to why. There might be some good reasons why they do it this way, and you just haven't got enough experience to understand why. Why are you meeting at 4:00 in the afternoon on Sundays? Don't you know the scriptural time is 5 or 6? You do one of those and they'll give you the answer. Well, we do that so that there's plenty of time because we do a lot of get together activities in the evening, and we want to make sure that we have time to do that because we've also got young families and we want those young families to be involved, but those kids need to be able to go to bed. That's a very reasoned out, thoughtful explanation of knowing the congregation and still being able to accommodate it to get the right ends in mind. Okay. And you as a preacher, you're stuck with, yeah, but that means I don't have as much time for my nap in the afternoon before the next sermon. Okay, well, that's a you problem, not a congregational problem. And you need to know the difference between those as you're discussing these. Again, ask questions.
So we've talked about the official side of the relationship and the personal side of the relationship. I think with this last discussion and submission, there's also a spiritual aspect to the relationship between a preacher and the elders. And I think that's maybe a part that I myself hadn't thought about as much before. As you think about the official working relationship and you think about growing those personal relationships and how helpful that is. But I think sometimes we might take the spiritual nature of it for granted. And I think we need to put the emphasis back on that. This is a spiritual work that we are doing. And it's a spiritual work the elders are doing. And both of those roles were created by God. There is a spiritual work being done in the church, and so it requires spiritual thinking, spiritual effort, and spiritual study and spiritual work on the preacher's part in order to relate to the elders in the way that a preacher should.
Well, and I think that also goes back to something we alluded to earlier, right? What is the environment in which the elders are used to conducting not only the elder-preacher relationship, but also the church in general? Because what you'll find, going back to that word business, right, what happens a lot of times, which is why I also prefer this idea of official, is that we treat the church like a business. And especially many elderships, just kind of naturally gravitate towards conducting the church and their leadership of the church like a business. That includes in hiring decisions. It's very much a employer-employee type relationship is what they're expecting and stuff like that. And this is not to say that to cast judgment on elders who go that direction. A lot of them come from a business background. They have shown great leadership ability in a business background, and therefore people are like, well, if they have leadership ability in this way, maybe that will transfer over. Now, that's not exactly the model we're given in Scripture, but nonetheless, that's often what happens. And so you have to be understanding that that's where a lot of times people are coming from. If you see that that's an issue, one of your goals will be to kind of help shift that away from that kind of mindset.
So we've had a lot of good thoughts, I think, on starting elder relationships right and looking at it from the right perspective and navigating maybe some issues that might come up very early in a relationship with your elders, especially as a new preacher. I'd like us to wrap up by thinking long-term more into the future about elder relationships over potentially years working with a congregation. And I'd like to get a thought from each of you on how can you maintain a growth trajectory in your relationship with your elders? That is, how can you be growing that relationship over time instead of maybe stagnating in that original figuring out how things are working?
Well, that's why it is important to inject the spiritual as early as possible into the relationship. That what you're trying to do is make sure that in your questions you ask and in any interaction you have, you're bringing things up that pertain to the work and showing a spiritual interest and trying to make sure that that is a main aspect of the relationship from the very beginning. When I was successful or most successful, I felt it was because I had a strong relationship with the elders and we got together and talked a lot. And we had set times that I would be in there with the elders. And I'll just tell you, when that didn't happen, I really ended up losing time because I'm trying to figure out, where do I stand with the elders? What's going on? And it feels like at that point, the team aspect has been lost. Oftentimes, and I'll just tell you, that can happen whenever you get new elders who don't know how things work, and that they haven't been elders. They've seen you as a preacher, and they don't know how the eldership is supposed to work exactly yet with the preacher. And so they're trying to figure that out. So make the most of those opportunities. Make sure that you are hospitable and inviting them into your home. Neil brought this up earlier. Try to get them on different ones, rotating in where you're using everyone, and you're doing something in the work together with each one of them. Making visits could be evangelistic. It could be hospital visits. It could be this person has an issue visits, but make sure that different things you do, you're doing something to integrate them, that you're involved in something spiritual together, and you have opportunity to discuss something spiritual together. That, I would argue, is the best way to establish and then maintain a relationship that is going to be balanced in all of these areas.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I think about in relation to that, if we can go back to the metaphor, right, of marriage for just a second, you do all this stuff to pour into your relationship when you're first getting to know someone and, right after you get married, right? And then sometimes, if you're not intentional, that kind of dies off. The same thing can happen in an elder and a minister relationship, where I'm putting all this effort in to really get to know my elders, to build a relationship, to strengthen my relationship with my elders at the beginning, the first year, maybe the first couple of years. And then, okay, I have a good relationship with my elders now, and then I just kind of stop doing all that. That's not how any relationship works. If you stop investing, the relationship doesn't maintain status quo, it dies. So don't do that. If you want to, in the long term, as you asked Caleb, keep a relationship going, you have to keep investing. Now, is that going to look the same as it did at the beginning? Not at all. But still, you need to keep doing that. And one more thing I would add in terms of the long term, if you are at a congregation for a good length of time, the odds are, just given the nature of eldership, some of the elders are probably going to have to step back, and others are probably going to have to be put in their place. So you, as a minister, if you want to be investing in good elder relationships, don't just invest in relationships with the current elders. Be looking for and investing in the men who are going to be filling that role in the future as well. You are going to have advance notice, hopefully, of the kinds of people who are going to be doing that. So even beyond just the fact that you want to develop relationships in general, make sure you are developing relationships with the people who are going to be in there as well, because that's going to help the transition. That's going to help your future relationship. It's going to help the dynamics of that eldership. It's going to help all of that immensely.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you also need to remember that you should be going in and you should be more aware of how much this relationship matters. They may not be. They may not be aware that there's even any relationship there. They may not think in those terms. So there will be a challenge in some cases of trying to get to know somebody because they don't think in terms of relationship and why that even matters that you get to know them, because they have maybe a total business kind of approach to things, or a hands-off approach, or that the congregation may just be kind of keeping house and that they're keeping you at arm's length because they don't, anything that needs to be done, you need to be the one doing it. You just kind of have to be aware that every single one of those things exists in some way. Obviously, they're not all healthy, but you need to go in and put in that time. And yes, you do have to work at those relationships. And every time, even if you've got a good relationship with someone beforehand, when they go in as an elder, you need to establish a different kind of relationship with them. And that can be hard because it's harder for them because they haven't figured out what it is. Most go in thinking that now I'm in charge of your salary and I'm your boss and all those things. And they don't understand the teamwork aspect of this and the fact that they didn't become a genius and all knowing in the Bible because they came into the eldership. Okay. Any more than when you graduate across and walk across the stage and they hand you a diploma, all of a sudden you become the preacher who knows all and that can ask you. That doesn't work that way. So don't act as you go into a congregation. You're not there to be a know-it-all, and they aren't there because they can do it all. And you need to be able to work with that. But everybody is coming with their own assumptions and background of what they've observed. And you have to be patient about that. And you have to work the relationship to make it work. Okay. Because you're the one that should be the most aware. I'd say most elders that I've worked with, they often do it naturally. They want you to succeed. They appreciate you, especially if you're really giving good lessons, you're supporting the truth, and you're teaching people and they're growing. The elders can feel it. You're taking a lot off their plate if you can go in and be a steadying force rather than a catalyst for chaos. They'll appreciate that very much, and they will be drawn to you because you're doing a good job. The better job you do makes it easier and easier on the elders. So they're going to want to be part of that if they recognize that at all and they understand relationships at all. So go in wanting to serve, do a good job, serve God first. And if you've got God-loving and God-fearing elders, they're going to appreciate that and they're going to feel something for you. If you expect as a young preacher to go in and you look at them and all you see is old people, then you're the problem. Okay? Those people are your greatest assets. So get to know them, get to be friends with them. And I feel like that's been the case for me over 30-something years, that anytime I was with elders, we were able to do a lot of good together. And the age didn't matter. I really always appreciated them and became close to them as a result.
Thank you, Kevin and Neil, for your advice and your insight. I want to take this time to let you, our listener, know that if you have any questions or topics or ideas of what you would like to hear us address on the podcast, feel free to contact us at browntrailschoolofpreaching.com. We'd love to hear those questions, hear your feedback, and be able to help you in any way we can. Thank you for joining our conversation today on the Ministry Mentoring Podcast. Follow the podcast wherever you listen to make sure you catch the next conversation each week. Again, this podcast is hosted by the Brown Trail School of Preaching as a way to encourage and provide value to ministers everywhere. God bless you as you grow in His service.